One of the things I love about Halloween is the ability to steal candy from my kids' baskets. I'm just kidding. I didn't steal it from my kids. I stole it from up here. Give me a break. But all joking aside, we've been talking a lot lately about the intersect of science and faith. Where do those two collide? How are they compatible? And to what extent can we actually believe in a God that we can't see and yet still live in a world of science? Lots of great questions we've been getting into and we could get into even deeper, but today I want to give you 4 scientific realities that point towards a God. Number 1 is the argument from complexity. We live in an incredibly complex world. Nobody would deny that. I mean, even think of the world of technology that we live in today. I could pull out my phone or this computer on my wrist called a watch, or this camera that I'm using to record this very video on, and you would look at all those things and see how very complex they are and how all these different moving pieces work together in order to make it function the way that it's supposed to. Nobody looks at those things and goes, wow, it's amazing how that accidentally came together. Like, everybody sees that and knows that there is an author to that there's a designer. But just like we would look at all of our tech and instinctively know that there was a design behind that, the same is true when we look at all the different aspects of life on Earth today. Specifically when it comes to you and me. As science has gained a deeper understanding of the complexity of our DNA, there seems to be this ever-increasing pile of evidence that points to an author behind that. Somebody designed this complex digital code that serves as the blueprint for life. Microsoft founder Bill Gates put it this way. He said that DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created. And just like scientists would look at a computer code and know that somebody designed that, they look at the complex DNA code and know somebody had to design that. The very complexity in all of that seems to very logically point to the idea that there had to have been somebody behind all that. The second reality comes from the fine-tuning argument, or sometimes known as the teleological argument. Similarly to the argument from complexity, the fine-tuning argument talks specifically about all the different random parameters that have to line up perfectly when it comes to the laws of physics, or even the foundational building blocks to chemistry, that our planet Earth is finely tuned for life. If the constants of nature, like the strength of gravity, the mass of a proton, or the charge of an electron, were just a tiny bit off from the way that they are, then this Earth would not be able to sustain life at all. Atoms would not hold together, our Earth and our atmosphere would not be sustainable for oxygen and life, the sun would burn up our atmosphere. Scientists have discovered that there's over 200 different parameters that have to work in perfect harmony in order for life to be sustainable on Earth. So just to give you an understanding of exactly how fine-tuned all of that has to be in order to work properly, the odds of this Earth accidentally forming into the way that we see today and sustaining life is the equivalent of a coin being tossed over 10 quintillion times, with a Q, quintillion times, and landing heads every single time. Now, to give you a visual image of exactly how many coins that is, that adds up to like multiple skyscrapers bunched together in order to reach that many coins stacked up on top of each other. You would have to toss a coin over 10 quintillion times before it ever lands on tails. The odds of that are just astronomical. They're improbable. They're more than improbable. They're next to impossible. In other words, just like it takes faith to be a Christian, believe that God designed the world that you and I live in today, it takes arguably even more faith to believe that all of this just came together by accident. The world we live in today seems prime, perfectly fine-tuned to sustain the life that you and I get to live today. This argument is so strong. In fact, it's the argument that famous atheist Richard Dawkins has even said, if there were ever an argument for God, this would be it. In fact, check out his own words about this.
I am arguing not that the evolutionary process is incapable of generating complexity. I think it totally is. You and I are in the same place here as far as the odds.
There's no doubt about that, yeah.
Right. But you said that, well, it's happened just because of the laws of physics. I want to take this back to that step. Where did those come from?
Well, let's get to that then, because you keep getting to that, and that, I believe that's a very profound. I mean, if somebody was going to convince me of the need for a God, it would be there. It would be not in my own field of biology. And I found, I mean, I've read The Language of God, and indeed I reread it today. When you come on later to the origin of the physical constants, now that's getting warm, that's getting close to a good argument. The physical constants, things like the speed of light, gravitational constant, and strong and weak force and things, physicists agree, most physicists agree, that if you change any of those constants by even a very, very small amount, then we don't come into existence. The universe doesn't come into existence. They have to be like that in order for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for chemistry to form, actually, and then for the prerequisite for life to evolve needs that as well. So that's the nearest approach to a good argument.
Well, look, I'm very familiar with this argument as well. Often called the argument for God from fine tuning. It's essentially a design argument. It's saying, look at the extraordinary fine tuning of these initial constants of the universe. If they differed from their actual value just a tiny bit, we wouldn't have a universe capable of producing life. And yet here we are. It needs an explanation. One of the explanations on the table is a designer behind the whole thing. And when you look at the extraordinary numbers we're talking about, you can see why it does. Even for someone like you, Richard, you said if there were an argument, it might be this one. And actually, I've heard many other atheists say that. Peter Millikan, I think Hitchens, all said, okay, that might be the one if you were going to, crack the door open a little bit.
So now it's pretty incredible, right? I think even a few years ago he wouldn't have admitted to that, but for him that isn't everything, right? For him, there's still this giant leap between there being a designer behind the world. He says he might be a deist, which means that there is a God, but he now stands aloof, apart from everything, not involved in our lives. There's a gap in his mind between a designer and someone like Jesus, the God in human form, coming. Now, I'm going to get to that question in another video, so stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe and like this video, and come back because I'm going to be posting a whole nother video addressing exactly that. Now, let's talk about beginnings, which is the third thing I want to talk about today. The Big Bang Theory is the most widely accepted theory for the origins of the universe in the scientific community. Now, that is an explanation that comes from trying to explain our world without a God. But in this theory, what it proposes is that there was a single moment in history, an igniting moment where all life started by a Big Bang. Now, we know that matter doesn't just come from non-matter. There can't be nothing and suddenly there's something. And just like energy can't just come from no energy, right? There's for every action, there's an equal or greater reaction. There is something that caused the energy, that caused the explosion, and there had to have been matter to create the atoms that happened and came from that explosion. But put all that aside, the evolutionary theory pontificates that in this one moment, this Big Bang, then suddenly things started to evolve over time. And this is where we get, after billions of years, the universe that you and I see today. What it also notices, and from modern astronomy, is that the universe is ever expanding. It hasn't stopped expanding from that ignition point, from that initial Big Bang. What's interesting is that if you take out some of the evolutionary theory jargon and terminology and you replace it with Genesis 1:1, it actually fits pretty well. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there's been lots of debate, even among Christians, about then how that continued to unfold, whether it was exactly like it described in Genesis, being a 24-hour day and God spoke things into existence each day, or if God spoke the initial bang into existence and then that he guided the evolution from there. Now, I've got my own theories and opinions about that we can talk about at a different time, but the reality is that really doesn't matter as much because our faith doesn't hang on how the universe got here, as long as we understand who was behind it. Now, again, the evolutionary theory is trying to explain the universe without God, given the evidence that we have. The only difference is not necessarily the evidence, but the interpretation of it. And as Christians, we view the world as being created by an intelligent designer who holds all things together. And so we believe that single ignition point came from our God. Now, the fourth thing is archaeology. And there's lots of things that you could look up online about archaeological discoveries that seem to prove what we read about in our Bible today. But possibly the most significant archaeological discovery in the last 100 years was the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was discovered in an Israeli cave. Now, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls, you may ask? Excellent question. See, the Dead Sea Scrolls were a version of the Old Testament that dates back to like pre-Jesus, like 100 years BC. They are original manuscripts in Hebrew of our Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures. Now, why is that so significant? Because in those scriptures, there are hundreds of Messianic prophecies. In other words, prophecies that refer to Jesus Christ as the Messiah in many specific ways. I'll let you look them up later. I'll try to link some below. But these scriptures point to Jesus Christ. And the fact that these were discovered to date back 100 years before Jesus ever walked the earth, it's incredibly convincing that Jesus is who he says he was. One of the biggest arguments against the Messianic prophecies is that some monks in the Middle Ages were, when they were transcribing into English, they fudged some of the language and the terminology around in order to suit a Christian mindset, a Christian belief, a Christian doctrine that Jesus was the Messiah by adding these prophecies back into the Old Testament, hundreds or thousands of years later. But the reality is that these, dating back to before Jesus, proves that what we have today is like word for word what we had in the originals here. That Jesus is who he says he was. That these Messianic prophecies talked about in the Jewish scriptures refer to the one that we call Jesus, the Messiah. Proving that they have been untampered with after Jesus' life in order to reflect a Christian belief system. This is huge. Now, we could talk a lot more about a lot of different things in the scientific world that point to the Christian faith and stuff like that, but these are the big ones that I wanted to cover. We haven't had time to cover them in our main sessions and our gatherings on Sundays, and so I wanted to make sure I put them in here. Now, I'm going to add links to references and the stuff that I've talked about in this video below, so you can check them out yourself. And again, I'm going to be releasing more content as to why Jesus? How do you go from the leap of all these scientific realities to, okay, then there may be a God, but then what about Jesus? What about the claims of Christianity? What differentiates that from, say, Islam or Buddhism or any of these other religious systems, okay? Christianity is uniquely different and positioned by the truth given the evidence that we have. You don't have to be afraid of questions. You just have to know where to look to find the answers and be able to differentiate, to have the discernment to differentiate between what is fact, what is the evidence, and what is opinion, what's the interpretation of that evidence. If you go into it with a mindset of, hey, there is a God that is behind all of this, I can show you the evidence. If you go into it with a mindset of there is no God, I think you're going to have a harder time making some faith leaps to make dots connect. Just my personal biased opinion. That's all I got for you today. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned as we release more content regarding this stuff. See you guys later.